and the Russians handing over Ukrainian prisoners, for example, and it is kind of described, or it is portrayed in this Russian readout as the Russians, offering compromise in a sense, but there isn't really much compromise in this beyond that. And as you mentioned, this question of whether the US is agreeing to restrict support for Ukraine during this ceasefire, that will be deeply controversial because, okay, after the ceasefire, what happens? What kind of negotiation is there during the ceasefire over what kind of support Ukraine might get? And of course, one of President Putin's long-standing aims has been to ensure that Ukraine is neutral, and Ukrainians would say to neutralize.
Donald Trump is Vladimir Putin's puppet. This is not some wild theory or a crazy conspiracy. It's clear and plain fact. And the terms of the ceasefire agreement that Putin and Trump just came to on their call is all the evidence you need for it. Because after Russian state TV claimed that Donald Trump was quite literally using Kremlin talking points when discussing Ukraine and attacking President Zelensky, we have an even closer look into exactly how he was essentially instructed by Russia on what to give up. Donald Trump will try to claim this ceasefire as some massive win for peace in his ability to negotiate, but what it actually is a knifing of our ally in Ukraine at the exact direction of Putin. And we know that because of a breaking leaked report from a Kremlin think tank that we are going to get into. But before we do, if I can quickly ask you to leave a like on this video, and if you haven't already, and you enjoy our channel, to hit that subscribe button. It goes a long way. And it really does mean a lot to me now. Before we can get into that leaked report, I want to hear a little bit more on the terms of this agreement from the folks at MSNBC right here.
You've got it now?
Yep.
Okay,
yeah.
So it's from the news agency.
We have the Russian readout, Chris, if that's... Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm looking for. And you can tell me, but the part that I got to that raised a red flag was this. It was emphasized that the key condition for preventing the escalation of the conflict and working toward its resolution by political and diplomatic means should be the complete cessation of foreign military aid and the provision of intelligence information to Kyiv. But maybe you've had a chance to read the entire thing, which I'm only about halfway through.
Yeah, I'm still picking through it myself, Chris. It's been translated from Russian. One thing I will tell you, just for viewers to know, and the viewers will understand that we're still making sense of this, is that the Kremlin readout and the White House readout is different. So they haven't kind of agreed a joint statement. They've put out their different interpretations of what's been said. I will say that as far as we can tell from the Kremlin readout, it does not include a mention of the Black Sea. So one of the points I would make here is that I think that this is still negotiations in progress. So a week ago, the Ukrainians appeared to agree to, well, they agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, punctuation point, nothing more. Here you have a negotiation between the US and the Russians about all kinds of things, not simply a ceasefire. Now what the Kremlin does say, and I'll just read this piece because as Garrett suggested, this is important. During the conversation, Donald Trump put forward a proposal for the parties to the conflict to mutually refrain from striking energy infrastructure facilities for 30 days. Vladimir Putin responded positively to this initiative and immediately gave the Russian military the corresponding order. So it appears right now the Russians have agreed to and are implementing a 30-day ceasefire in respect of energy infrastructure facilities. Simply that. Now there is a lot more to this Russian readout, including a lot about prisoner exchanges and the Russians handing over Ukrainian prisoners, for example, and it is kind of described, or it is portrayed in this Russian readout as the Russians, offering compromise in a sense, but there isn't really much compromise in this beyond that. And as you mentioned, this question of whether the US is agreeing to restrict support for Ukraine during this ceasefire, that will be deeply controversial because, okay, after the ceasefire, what happens? What kind of negotiation is there during the ceasefire over what kind of support Ukraine might get? And of course, one of President Putin's long-standing aims has been to ensure that Ukraine is neutral, and Ukrainians would say to neutralize the country. So that would appear to be a concession to the Russians. There's another point in here which I didn't hear. I haven't seen the Washington readout, but I didn't hear, Chris, in what you were sharing with viewers. The Russian readout talks a lot about normalization, which translates as removing sanctions, rebuilding economic ties, the kind of things that the Russians really want. One last point, Chris, in this Russian readout, which kind of gets your attention, although it may seem fairly small compared with the others. It says Donald Trump supported Vladimir Putin's idea to organize hockey matches in the US and Russia between Russian and American players playing in the NHL and the KHL.
All right, so let me go back to you, if I can, Garrett. The look on your face may say everything about hockey, but on the bigger picture, clearly these are two very different statements and no decisions. That there's no clarity on any agreement here.
Well, look, I think there are a couple of points. On the idea of the 30-day ceasefire against energy infrastructure, that does seem to be the big key deliverable point that is, at least in principle, agreed on in both statements. The Kremlin...
Donald Trump will try to lad this as some win for his ability to negotiate his status as a peacemaker around the globe while he tries to go to war with Panama and Canada. But that's not true. Donald Trump continued to hurt and weaken the negotiating position of our allies in Ukraine throughout this whole discussion about a ceasefire. And that is ultimately concluded with them being in a worse position than when they started during the Biden presidency. And that is because of Donald Trump. And that was all architected out from the beginning. And we can see that in this report right here, Document for Russian Leaders outlines plan to prolong Ukraine war by creating Trump tensions. A document prepared for the Kremlin by a Moscow-based think tank states a peaceful resolution to the Ukraine war cannot happen before 2026. The document drawn up in February outlines the Russian plan to weaken the U.S. position on the Ukraine crisis by boosting tensions between the Trump White House and other nations as Russia moves ahead with its plans to pick apart the country. The document, obtained by a European intelligence agency and reviewed by the Post, argues that the current Ukrainian government needs to be fully dismantled. The current key regime cannot be changed from inside the country. Its complete dismantling is needed. The report states, the think tank behind the document has close connections to the Russian Federal Security Service, which is in charge of Russian operations in the war-torn country, and pushes extreme demands for a peace deal, stating that Donald Trump's plan to reach a peace agreement within 100 days is impossible. The plan also rejects any notion that peacekeepers will be allowed in Ukraine, as several European leaders have suggested. In addition, the document insists on recognition of Russian sovereignty over the territory it is seized in Ukraine, he noted. They consistently talk about the root causes, which are about the domestic politics in Ukraine, and even more important than that, the European security architecture, which would be the role of NATO. A simple ceasefire, which doesn't take that into account, is of no interest to Russia, and Trump doesn't appear to understand Kremlin spokesperson. A Kremlin spokesperson told the newspaper that the Russian government was not aware of such recommendations. Outline of the document. So from what we heard on what the terms of this agreement are, it is clear that Donald Trump will be falling in line with all of the demands of Putin to recognize the land that has been claimed by Russia in this war unlawfully, to not keep any of the aid that we have been sending to Ukraine, to not allow them to access our security information. That will all be cut off as Donald Trump looks to weaken the Ukrainian position so Putin can return years from now, a year from now, 30 days from now, whatever it may be, Donald Trump wants to cut off support. He wants to stop any further involvement with NATO, and he wants to leave Ukraine stranded and struggling after recognizing Russian sovereignty and the land that it has stolen from the Ukrainian people. That is Donald Trump's plan. And it was the plan outlined by Putin. This is not a peace deal. This is the first step in greater escalation of the conflict in a way that leaves Ukraine much weaker than it was before. This is so Donald Trump can parade around with a fake win, when in reality, we know he's just helping Putin. He has been completely played, or he is just voluntarily helping Putin, which is likely the outcome, and essentially what Mark Kelly predicted and warned against when he was asked about what a potential agreement should look like just a couple of days ago.
When you got back from Ukraine, you posted about your trip, an incredibly lengthy thread that everyone should read, I think, just of what it was like on the ground. Yeah. Elon Musk responded by calling you a traitor.
He did. What? Well, that
You're
was
a combat veteran.
that was kind of my reaction when I was flying over Iraq, getting shot at, or flying in the space shuttle. Never once for a second did I think somewhere down the road somebody's going to call me a traitor. But Caitlin, this isn't really about me and what I'm really
not just
concerned.
somebody.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a guy with a lot of power, a lot of influence over this government. I think it says a lot about him. It says much more about him than it does about me. But what really concerns me is veterans that he is firing without cause from the government. These are public servants. I had a disabled veteran in my office the other day that had recently received an excellent performance report. And 3 weeks later, Elon Musk fires him through an email because of poor performance. That's wrong. That's not fair. Fired him without cause. It has ruined his life. And there are 6,000 veterans just like him.
We also saw Todd Young and Lindsey Graham pushed back on what Elon Musk had to say, calling you a traitor. Are you surprised that you haven't heard from more Senate Republicans, more of your colleagues?
I've heard from them in the Armed Services Committee in the ante room today.
What did they say to you?
Well, we're kind of joking about it. People are. I got to be careful what I say, in public about what my Republican colleagues say. But we were talking about what he said about me, and it was. It would have been interesting for you to watch if you were in there.
Why? Because they were essentially, without naming them.
We get along very well.
Them, but
I've got very good relationships with my Republican colleagues. And I would say they don't like this kind of behavior.
The Senate Republicans don't like Elon Musk calling you a traitor.
There are a number of them that came up to me to talk to me about this. And yeah, of course, they're not happy with this.
But they didn't say anything.
I mean, this guy has a very powerful job in the United States government. He's got tremendous influence. After the president, I don't think there's somebody with more influence right now over the federal government than Elon Musk. And he's wasting his time on Twitter, insulting people, insulting veterans, calling me a traitor, calling other people's names. Is this a serious person? I don't think he is. So why do you give him this influence? And
it is no shock that this is the place that we have landed, where Donald Trump is helping Putin and eventually setting him up for a larger invasion of Eastern Europe down the line. That is what Donald Trump ultimately wants to do. Do is to abandon our allies and claim it to be peace, when in fact we know what he is actually having as his end goal: to serve Putin in whatever way is possible. And there was the mention of the Russian and American hockey games. Donald Trump wants to pretend like this is the end of any tensions between America and Russia, and we are now all friends. Again, he is trying to change the narrative. He is trying to pretend that a peace deal has been brought. That is not what this is. And it's clear who's running the show. It's Vladimir Putin. And that is incredibly scary. And we cannot allow him to get away with a narrative that this is some big win, because it's not. This leaked document shows what actually happened here. And we have to call it out. We're certainly going to on the show every single day. And if you want to support that, as always, you can hit that subscribe button. You can leave a like on this video. And if you're stuck around to the end, you can drop a blue heart in the comments. And until next time, I'll see you soon.